a black start is something that no utility or grid operator ever wants to have to do. It's like that is the worst possible case scenario in for anybody in the electricity industry. And go back to the example Texas a couple of years ago when they had that massive failure during the winter. That actually wasn't a complete failure like this. They actually what Texas did was they kicked millions of people off the electric grid in order to save it so that they didn't have to do a black start. That's how bad things were. They'd rather have most of the state in the dark to protect the grid than to let it fail to what happened in Spain.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host Amy Cooke. And for this week's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to broaden our horizons a bit beyond the borders of Colorado, actually across the Atlantic.
A little bit.
Just because I think there are some potential lessons to be learned here in the state of Colorado. And of course, what I'm talking about is what outlets like the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg have deemed the first major blackout of the clean energy era. And we have some great guests on to talk about that today. I'll let you introduce them.
Yeah, actually, you're right. All the rage, all the topic, all the talk, all the chatter on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, those are the two places where I tend to skulk about. and there was a lot of conversation about what happened on the Iberian Peninsula, meaning mostly Spain and Portugal, and they had to your point, the first major blackout of I would call it of the wind and solar, really of a wind and solar grid. And so to talk about it, because you and I are not necessarily experts on inertia and some of the other things that came up in this particular situation. First, we're going to talk with Kenny Stein, who's the Vice President of Policy for one of my absolute favorite organizations, and it's the Institute for Energy Research. You can find all of their work at it's instituteforenergyresearch.org. We always call it by its short name, which is IER, but no one better to talk about this than Kenny Stein from IER. Kenny, thanks so much for coming on the show. And you guys did a great post about this. And I've actually found a couple of really good primers so that people can learn exactly what happened. How did two countries, Spain and Portugal, go dark? And then how did they recover? And you guys have one of the two that I think are really, really good for our audience, and we'll drop both in the show notes. But tell us a little bit more about what happened in Spain and Portugal. Why did these two European countries I think it was within 5 seconds, just went dark at like noon on a Tuesday or something?
Sure. So, yeah, to start with, the actual triggering event is still being investigated. They have some idea, but this is the type of thing that a major catastrophe like this, and this truly is a catastrophe. The investigation of it usually takes quite a few months to figure out, because there's normally not just one thing that happened. It's a cascade of failures that led to the end result here. But the initial investigation by the Spain's energy regulator or grid manager was that there appears to have been at two different locations that there was a sudden loss of electricity generation. Now, it was not specifically said that those were renewable energy locations, but if you read between the lines of their press conference, that probably both locations were solar facilities. They haven't quite admitted that yet, but that's probably where this originated. The problem is, though, is that after the initial facility went offline for unknown reasons at this point, the grid that affected the frequency of the grid, but the grid managed to stabilize after that initial point. The second failure, though, led to frequency getting so out of whack on Spain and Portugal's grid that they actually disconnected from the rest of the European grid. They have an interconnector through southern France, and that interconnection disconnected. And once that interconnection was disconnected, basically the entire grid in Spain and Portugal proceeded to collapse. in a cascading failure. And because the frequency got out of whack, there was nothing to stabilize it. So power plants one by one tripped off. So all of Spain's nuclear plants shut down for safety reasons. They disconnected from the grid and shut down, sent their reactors into standby mode. What gas plants were online also disconnected, and even the wind and solar generation, which the sun was still shining at the time, but they all disconnected from the grid because the frequency got out of within the narrow bands that they are supposed to keep it within, and everybody cut off. And electricity generation in all of Spain and Portugal went to zero within just a few seconds. So that meant that there was no opportunity for safety shutdowns. The high-speed rail were shut down in the middle of nowhere in the countryside. There's video of people like standing by the tracks waiting for rescue. Subways shut down. The entire economy shut down because everything's run on electricity at this point.
So then hospitals shut down, schools, everything just
Yep.
everything just goes dark. One of the things I think you said in there that I think was cute, you talked about it getting out of balance. This is one of the things we talk about a little bit, and that's it has to be. I don't think people realize that it has to be balanced all the time, and there's a little tiny variation, but you can't have the variation or what happened in Spain. You just you
Right.
can't have that wide. You can't have that wide of a fluctuation.
Yeah, but what most people don't realize is that, the electricity grid to us seems quite robust. You flick the switch on your wall and it turns on. But it's a constant balancing act, and supply and demand always have to be continuously balanced throughout the day. Even as demand increases or decreases, power generation has to come online, or it has to ramp up or ramp down in order to constantly match that the supply and demand together. So that's what a grid regulator does. That's what the various utilities that manage the power plants do. But it's a constant dance, and you have to maintain the frequency of the electricity generation within a very narrow band, because basically all modern electronics, if the frequency of the AC current that's coming in gets outside that narrow band, it'll fry all your electronics. So that's why all these power plants tripped offline, is that once the frequency got outside the bands that they could manage, that they had to shut down or disconnect in order to protect themselves from going into a meltdown or having all their electronics fried and not being able to restart ever again. So if you to the point you said, for inertia purposes, just wanted to explain what people might know what the noun inertia means. The tendency to keep doing what something's doing. A rock that's at rest tends to stay. A spinning top, if you poke a spinning top, it'll try and stay up spinning. So when we're talking about inertia in the electric grid, that's referring to the spinning of turbines. When you think of a power station, if you've ever seen a picture of it, there's those large tubes, that circular tubes, and inside there are turbines that are spinning constantly. And all the turbines that are spinning on a grid are all spinning at the same rate. And that spinning, that physical spinning, is what creates the frequency of your electricity on that grid. So as you can tell from that, everything has to be in sync. And once things start to get a little bit out of sync, there is a benefit to that inertia, that those turbines tend to want to continue to spin. So you have that little bit of protection on the grid, that if the frequency rises or drops, some like this event in Spain, there is some protection in the grid built into these spinning turbines, and that can stabilize the grid. Now it'll only stabilize things for milliseconds, maybe as many as a few seconds. This isn't gonna protect the grid for hours, but it gives you just enough time for the grid regulator to turn on emergency backup capacity, have anybody that's online ramp up production as much as possible, or decrease production depending on what is needed to be done. So that inertia gives you just a little bit of extra stability that allows you to be resilient to events like what happened in Spain.
Yeah, just to put a little bit of a fine point on that, can you specify which types of power resources tend to provide that kind of inertia? And sort of related, there was an interesting claim, a Reuters piece that said, "Don't blame renewables for what happened." And not, like as you mentioned, there's still a little bit of investigatory work that needs to be done about the acute cause, but it says, well, it may be tempting to blame the unprecedented power outage on the rapid growth of wind and solar in Spain. renewables are not to blame. Rather, the issue appears to be the management of renewables on the modern grid. So how do you respond to that and the related concept of inertia and which types of power sources provide
Right.
inertia?
Of course, that's the fundamental problem is that more renewables make the grid harder to manage.
Yeah.
But the inertia is provided by the spinning turbines, like the physical turbines. And that comes from nuclear generation. It can come from hydro generation. It comes from gas, can come from coal. Um, Spain doesn't do oil, but some countries do oil for power generation. But those, like it's the physical turbines that provide that inertia. Wind generation and solar generation do not have physical turbines. They generate DC current directly from the sun or from the spinning from the wind. So they don't provide any inertia benefits to the wider grid. And this became a problem in Spain because at the time of this failure, the national grid was running at about 78% wind and solar, which meant that you only had 20% of the electricity generation was producing that sort of beneficial inertia that could help stabilize things. So again, as you said, the acute point, we don't know that we can't say specifically this was renewables caused that initial failure, but it's pretty clear that the heavy renewables on the grid made the cascading massive failure much more likely. In a grid like in this, and actually the next door, the perfect example is France. France is a mostly nuclear power generation. They had this same frequency disruption coming across from Spain, but their failure was localized to the small area in the southwest of the country, in the Basque region, because the rest of the grid had enough stability that they were able to isolate it. Whereas in Spain, they were not able to isolate it, and the entire grid failed. So that's what we're saying when people talk about renewables make the grid harder to manage, make it less reliable, more unstable. This is precisely the event that people are talking about that instability.
Yeah, that's a great point about France and how quickly they got things back up and running and under control again because of that stability. To that point, I wanted to quickly touch on the Blackstart process or getting the grid back. What does that entail, and how did they do in Spain before we jump to Mitch to learn lessons about Colorado?
Right. Well, a black start is something that no utility or grid operator like ever wants to have to do. It's like that is the worst possible case scenario in for anybody in the electricity industry. And go back to the example Texas a couple of years ago when they had that massive failure during the winter. That actually wasn't a complete failure like this. What Texas did was they kicked millions of people off the electric grid in order to save it so that they didn't have to do a black start. That's how bad things were. They'd rather have most of the state in the dark to protect the grid than to let it fail, like what happened in Spain. Now, in a black start, basically what you have to do is you have to go back to start at the beginning. You're starting from zero. So their usual diesel, usually the diesel generated generators is where you start because diesel has fuel separate from the grid. So you can start that diesel generator up running, start it spinning. Then you can use that diesel generator to power up the rest of the power plant where it's at. Get those things spinning. And as you get generators spinning one by one, you can start connecting people to those electricity sources one by one. But it's a very slow process because, again, it always has to be in balance, supply and demand. So you start up several islands of electricity generation. As each power plant comes on, you connect customers, and then you slowly stitch the power plants all together to regenerate the entire grid. And it's very challenging. It's a long process. Spain actually did remarkably well coming back. Most of the time when people talk about a black start, you measure the timeline in days. And Spain managed to get most of the country back online within about 24 hours. Now they did have one benefit that they had the interconnectors with France, and they also have an interconnector with Morocco. So that was able to provide them with some frequency help because there are spinning generators in neighboring countries. So that probably helped speed up the black start process. But it's something that is very delicate. And another thing is that when you have a grid that's already been unstable and shut down and you don't know what caused it, it can be hard to do a black start because as you doing your black start, whatever caused that problem could cause it again and have everything shut down again. And so luckily, it seems like for their black start, everything went as well as it could. So, and the fact that this happened during a temperate time of year, there weren't a lot of lives lost. There wasn't a huge demand on the grid. So, for a massive failure. This might have been the best case scenario of a massive failure. But yeah, so they did remarkably well on the recovery, even though it was a catastrophic failure at the front end.
Thanks, Kenny. We want to turn to Mitch Rolling from Always On Energy Research. He's the research director there. Mitch, what we want to be able to do is look at what Spain is, their generating portfolio and how that might relate to Colorado. And you've spent a lot of time studying Colorado, and you know that the Colorado's path, the trajectory for generation is going to be, they would like it to be, or those in charge of energy policy would like it to be wind, solar plus batteries. Based on what happened in Spain, that is Colorado susceptible to a blackout like that?
Short answer, yes, if they continue going the direction that they're going. So just a little bit before the Spain blackouts took place, they were actually bragging about achieving 100% renewable energy on their grid. And that's exactly where Colorado wants to go. So at the time of the blackout, I think they're around 75 to 78% wind and solar. Well, Colorado wants to go 100% wind, solar, and storage. And while the storage might help alleviate some of the reliability concerns, it doesn't help alleviate some of the resiliency concerns that we saw in Spain, right? So reliability, the way I think about it as an easy one, is the ability to stop these disruptions, prevent disruptions from happening. Resiliency is how you respond to any disruptions on the grid. And so Colorado is leading by its over-reliance on wind and solar to a point where it has low reliability and low resiliency. And something like this may occur in the future, as we've shown in our modeling.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the modeling weaknesses, not just on the frequency and inertia side, like we talked about in France, but also just flat out on the generation side? I know you guys have, that's a specialty of your modeling, is that not only do you model the cost, but you model the reliability implications of a particular policy portfolio.
Right. And yeah, so with you guys, we did 3 portfolios that we modeled in Colorado. One, just replacing the current system of electricity to meet demand without electrification or EVs or anything. And then we did 2 more looking at electrification, the impacts of electrification and the impacts of electric vehicles. And what we showed in each one, not even getting into the cost, that's hundreds of billions of dollars for each scenario. But in each one, when we stress tested the system of wind and solar and battery storage that Colorado wants to do, we saw massive blackouts in each one, sometimes raising as high as 25 gigawatts at 1 hour. And so reliability wise, they just won't have enough generation resources, even with 260 or more gigawatts of generation assets online. They simply won't have enough to stop these disruptions from happening. And then added on to that, when you look at the resiliency, they won't have the generation resources online to manage that disruption and get the system back.
One of the things too, Mitch, that you guys do is you use historical weather patterns. Kenny had said that when this happened in Spain, as we know, it was a relatively temperate time of year. I mean that they weren't in the middle of a massive heat wave or a bitter cold spell. As Colorado shifts to a winter peaking system, what you all found was not only could we have blackouts, but they come at the worst time of year in the winter,
Yeah.
which cold kills far more than heat.
Absolutely. And that's what you saw in ERCOT. And actually, I was in that. I was one of those people in Texas who had their power cut for several days. And it wasn't fun. It switched so quickly to how do we survive this? Where do we go to eat and stuff? So in Colorado, if one of these events did happen in winter, I mean, it's going to be a night and day difference from what we saw in Spain, where people could kind of, like there were problems, but yeah, it wasn't the type of problems you would have with when you have to drive through snow to get where you're going, or try to find food in freezing temperatures or warmth. The problems just escalate out of control when you have a blackout in the middle of winter, which is where Colorado is heading.
To that end, what kind of lessons should Colorado be learning from this sort of event? And like you mentioned, the Winter Storm Uri and ERCOT. Assume for a moment you can put on your hat and you're in charge of policy in Colorado. What should policymakers be? What lessons should they be learning? Should we be boosting our interconnections with neighboring states because that appeared to help Spain? Should we be just building a bunch more thermals? What would you say is the main lessons to be learned from this sort of event for a state that is seems bent on emulating the trajectory that Spain itself is on?
Right. Well, I would love to be in that position. If I were in that position, it would keep thermal plants, build more coal and natural gas to meet growing needs. If I had to put a climate policy, an emissions reduction policy, I would be saying build more nuclear, but some type of thermal synchronous generator that can help prevent and withstand these disruptions on the grid. As Kenny said, in France, they didn't have this type of problem because they had these generators online. And so if I was in charge of policy, it would be keep your thermal generators, build more of them, totally disregard wind and solar. And that's the Mitch Rolling agenda.
Hey, Kenny, same question to you. What do you think Colorado, having now heard a little bit about what Colorado is doing, what lessons do you think we should take away from what happened in Spain?
I'm going to piggyback on Mitch, but certainly wind and solar are not fit for purpose for to dominate your grid. They are a niche product that can serve certain countries, certain areas of the United States. Like Arizona with their sun, maybe solar is helpful for them. But in Colorado in the winter, wind and solar are not going to heat your homes. They're not going to keep your lights on. So again, if emissions are your concern, then you need to be building nuclear. As you said, some building interconnections with neighboring states, that's all to the good. Now the problem is those interconnections can't be in place of having your own thermal generators, your own spinning capacity, because as we saw in Spain, if you get cut off from those interconnections, then you're an island unto yourself and you shut down. So it's about having your own capacity. And yes, interconnections will help. They're all to the good. They're also expensive though, and so you have to think about where you're allocating your resources. And again, if emissions is your biggest concern, then build some nuclear plants. Like that's not wind and solar. Nuclear can actually provide the electricity that modern society needs, and wind and solar really can't.
I have one more question for both of you, and I'm sorry, there's something that popped into my mind. So I was surprised that when everything shut down in Spain, wind turbines stopped too. They just stopped. And what I don't think people realize is there has to be some power to make the turbines go. Did I understand that correctly? And anyway, Mitch or Kenny, it looked like that you were getting zero from wind. They just stopped.
It depends on how things are designed, but certainly here's the thing: if the wind turbine doesn't have a connection to the grid, which it didn't, they were cut off, then it has to shut down because otherwise it's generating electricity that has nowhere to go. So it was the same thing. The solar panels, there are still plenty of solar panels and the sun was shining. And if they were plugged into something, they would generate electricity. But if the grid's gone, which is what happened, the grid literally vanished, the wind turbines and the solar panels became useless. They were just bricks. They were just piles of wire.
Quick question as we're coming up on time here. This is for either of you, if either of you know, but I'm hearing a lot more people maybe sort of in the line of the Reuters piece trying to massage renewables' role in all this, talking about things that we can do to maybe bolster the resilience of renewables, like adding flywheels and syncons and all these other concepts that keep coming up. Are you guys familiar with those? Is there a use case for that? Is that going to be more expensive to do that? Should we be requiring inverter-based resources to provide their own inertia like that? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, as a policy matter, yes. I mean, if you're gonna have those resources, yeah, they need to be providing like backup and stability. But as to the larger point, this is actually a weakness of a lot of the people who are claim that wind and solar are so wonderful, so cheap that they're going to do great things for society, is that when people talk about the cost, they're talking about just the cost of generation at the site of the panel or at the site of the turbine. They don't think about transmission costs. They don't think about inertia. There's ancillary benefits to these spinning turbines beyond just the electricity generation. There's that stability factor. And when people calculate the cost of wind and solar, they usually leave out all those balancing costs, those stability costs, the transmission costs, all those other things that go into making a grid that functions. And what needs to happen is that those costs need to be imputed and need to be considered when you're calculating and when you're deciding what the best resource to build at a given place in the given time is, because those are significant costs, and they're only rising as wind and solar increase on the grid and the grid becomes more unstable. Those stabilizing costs only go up.
And we actually did this in our Colorado reports. We showed some of these additional costs that wind and solar have. And when you do include them, they go from the little tiny ones that Lazard and other LCOE estimates show, anywhere from like 50 to $100, and they rise from anywhere from $300 to $400 per megawatt hour. When you actually have to balance the load with intermittent resources, the costs skyrocket.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mitch. I was just about to shout out your guys' approach to doing an all-in sort of levelized cost, because we see the normal, EIA or Lazard LCOEs thrown around by policymakers all the time to talk about how cheap these resources are, and that's why we just got to ad infinitum add them to the grid. So, but as we're coming up on time here, Amy, do you have any takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah, one is we take reliability for granted.
Yeah,
and we just think we're going to shut down thermal generation and we're going to pop up some wind turbines and some solar panels and it's all going to work fine. And we've been saying it for years. It's not. And Spain is a very expensive case study for us. And I'm thrilled that it turned out well, which is my second takeaway, which I'm impressed with how quickly they restarted. It wasn't looking good initially. And so whatever it is they did, and those interconnections, I love the fact that Spain needed to look to France and to Morocco. So they went to their European neighbors and to Africa to stabilize their grid. So good call for Spain. But I'll tell you what, if this doesn't tell you right now to get a generator, I don't know what else will. You're going to have to firm your own grid at home, because Colorado lawmakers and regulators aren't going to do it for you.
Yep. Like we always like to say, firm your own grid.
Yeah.
But that does it for us on another episode of PowerGab. If you folks like what you saw here, you can head over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio shows, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you want to reach out to us to suggest future show topics or great guests like Kenny and Mitch that you'd like to see us interview on the show, you can send those our way at info@powergab.org. We always love hearing from you guys. But until next week, we'll see you.